What would you do if you knew your next step would be the one that ruins you completely? Do you still take it, hoping fate has miscalculated, even as the world narrows to the space between the Alpha King's throne and your inevitable, humiliating fall? Chapter 1. The Weight of a Name. Do you know the specific taste of forbidden hope? It's the kind that blooms in your chest even when your bloodline marks you as unworthy, a single, foolish flower pushing up through cracked concrete. I tasted it now, a sweetness like wild honey on the back of my tongue, and I hated myself for it because hope was a luxury my family could no longer afford. The dress felt wrong against my skin, its fabric thin and coarse, a whisper of the life we used to have. It was a pale blue, the color of a sky before a storm, and my mother insisted it made my gray eyes look brighter. All I saw in the tarnished mirror was a ghost wearing a borrowed dream. "Stand up straight, Linda." My mother's voice was a frayed thread, stretched thin by years of shame. Her hands fluttered around my shoulders, picking at invisible lint, her own anxiety a suffocating perfume in our small, cramped apartment. She smelled of wilted roses and worry. "You must not draw attention. Be a mouse, a shadow. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat too tight for words. Of course I understood. Being a shadow was the only thing I had ever been taught to be, because we were the Sinclairs. And that name, once a banner of pride in our pack, was now a stain, a curse whispered in the same breath as traitor. This was the reason we lived in this forgotten corner of the territory. The reason my dress was secondhand, the reason my mother's eyes were perpetually shadowed with a grief that never faded. They would all be there tonight at the Omega Gala, the powerful, the beautiful, the whole. And then there would be me, the traitor's daughter. As if summoned by the thought, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. Alara. Her family had risen as mine had fallen, and she never let me forget it. Her cruelty was a constant, sharp reminder of my place. What did she have to fear from me? That girl. She has her father's venom. You must stay away from her, Linda. Promise me. "I promise," I whispered, the words tasting like ash, extinguishing the last flicker of that forbidden hope. Because my mother was right. The Omega Gala wasn't a place for dreams, not for me. It was a test of survival. The goal was to get through the night unnoticed, to breathe the same air as the Alpha King without him ever knowing I existed. But a treacherous little part of my wolf, the part that hadn't yet been crushed by our family's disgrace, whimpered a different story. It was a foolish, dangerous whisper that spoke of fated mates and second chances. A whisper that I had to ignore. Because if anyone discovered the secrets we kept, the real truth of what happened to my father, it wouldn't just be humiliation we'd face, it would be death. I took one last look at the pale girl in the mirror, her eyes too wide, her expression too fragile. Tonight, she had to be made of stone. Chapter 2. The Hall of 1,000 Eyes. Stepping into the great hall of the Alpha's citadel was like plunging into a shimmering, dangerous sea. The transition from our quiet, shadowed street to this explosion of life was a physical shock. 1,000 conversations buzzed in the air, a symphony of gossip and power plays. The light from a dozen massive chandeliers, each one a constellation of captured stars, splintered across the polished marble floor, making diamonds dance at my feet. The air was thick with a heady mix of scents, expensive perfumes, exotic flowers, and beneath it all, the intoxicating, terrifying aroma of powerful wolves. Alphas, betas, omegas, all radiating confidence and belonging, everything I was not. My mother's warning to be a shadow echoed in my mind, a frantic mantra against the pounding of my own heart. I clutched the small beaded purse in my hands, its strap slick with the sweat from my palm, and tried to melt into the tapestries that lined the walls. But even the woven scenes of legendary wolf hunts seemed to mock me, their heroic figures a stark contrast to my own cowering form. I felt like a field mouse that had wandered into a den of lions, every instinct screaming at me to flee. Why had I come? Because defiance was a flame I couldn't quite extinguish, a tiny spark that insisted I still deserved to exist, even in the margins. From that position of supposed safety, I saw her. Ilara. She was holding court near the central fountain, a vision in emerald silk that clung to her curves like a second skin. Her laughter was loud and silvery, drawing a circle of admirers around her. Her gaze swept the room, arrogant and dismissive, until it landed on me. Her perfect lips curled into a smirk. She nudged the handsome beta beside her and pointed discreetly with her chin. His eyes followed hers, and a look of open contempt spread across his face. The heat of their judgment felt like a physical touch, a brand searing my skin from across the hall. My cheeks burned. So much for being a shadow. I turned away, my throat closing up, and made my way to the refreshment table, not because I was thirsty, but because it gave me something to do. It provided a destination. I poured a glass of pale pink punch, my hand trembling so badly that the liquid sloshed over the rim. The punch was overly sweet, cloying, but I drank it down, the sugar a weak shield against the bitterness rising inside me. Just breathe. Survive. Go home. The 3 phrases became a silent rhythm, a prayer for the night to end. Then, everything changed. A hush fell over the hall. It wasn't a gradual quieting. It was a sudden, absolute cessation of sound, as if a switch had been flipped. The buzzing conversations, the clinking glasses, the light music, it all just stopped. A palpable wave of energy rolled through the crowd, a charge in the air like the moments before a lightning strike. Every head turned towards the grand entrance. The air thickened with a new scent, one that cut through all the others. It smelled of pine after a storm, of cold mountain air, of raw, untamed power. He was here. Alpha King Kalen stood in the doorway, a living embodiment of strength and authority. He was taller than I'd imagined from the official portraits, broader in the shoulders, his presence so immense it seemed to suck all the air from the room. He wore simple, severe black, which only made him stand out more against the glittering finery of his subjects. His dark hair was slightly untamed, and his face was all hard lines and sharp angles, as if carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were the color of molten gold, and they missed nothing. As his gaze swept across his pack, a primal fear and a strange, unwilling reverence coiled deep in my belly. My inner wolf, usually so timid, stirred with an unnerving mix of terror and recognition. I should have looked away. I had to look away. But for one heart-stopping second, I didn't. And his golden eyes met mine. Chapter 3. The King's Mercy. For that single, infinite moment when his gaze locked with mine across the crowded hall, the world fell away. There was no music, no whispers, no weight of 1,000 judgments, only the shocking intensity in the Alpha King's golden eyes. It wasn't the cold dismissal I expected. It was something else entirely. A flicker of surprise, a flash of something ancient and predatory that seemed to look right through my skin and into the deepest parts of my soul. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He looked away, his expression hardening back into a mask of command as he began to move into the room. But the damage was done. I was rattled, my carefully constructed walls of invisibility shattered by a single glance. My only thought was escape. I had to get away from the center of the room, away from the path of that approaching storm. I turned, intending to slip back to the shadowed alcove I'd abandoned, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My movements were clumsy, panicked. I didn't see the foot that slid out just a little too far into my path. I didn't hear the soft, triumphant hiss from behind me. All I knew was the sudden, sickening lurch as my ankle twisted, my balance vanished, and the world tilted on its axis. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The gasp that tore from my own throat sounded distant, foreign. I saw a kaleidoscope of shocked faces, shimmering gowns, and mocking eyes turning towards me as I fell. The ground rushed up to meet me with brutal speed. My hands shot out, but it was too late. I landed hard on my hands and knees, the impact jarring my teeth, the cheap fabric of my dress ripping at the seam with a quiet, final sound of humiliation. And then came the laughter. It started as a single, cruel titter, Ilara's, I was certain, and then it swelled, a wave of ridicule that washed over me, drowning me. It was a physical force, pressing me down, stealing the air from my lungs. Every fear I had walked in with tonight had just come true in the most spectacularly public way possible. I wanted the marble floor to crack open and swallow me whole. Tears burned behind my eyes, hot and shameful, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give them the satisfaction. Suddenly, as quickly as it had begun, the laughter died. An absolute, deafening silence crashed down upon the hall. A large shadow fell over me, blocking out the glittering chandeliers. It was a cold, immense presence, and it smelled of pine and storms. My breath hitched. Slowly, I lifted my head, my gaze traveling up a pair of immaculate black boots, past the hard line of powerful legs, to the severe black tunic of the Alpha King. He stood directly over me, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The entire pack held its breath, waiting, wondering. What would the king do to the clumsy, disgraced Omega who had just made a fool of herself at his feet? He should have walked past. He should have ignored me, a piece of dirt on his perfect floor. Instead, he knelt. The motion was fluid, powerful, and utterly shocking. Before I could process what was happening, his hands were on me. One slid around my waist, the other gently gripped my arm. His touch was warm. A strange electric heat seeped through the thin fabric of my dress, chasing away the cold chill of my shame. He lifted me as if I weighed nothing at all. As I was drawn to my feet, held securely in his arms, something impossible happened. A strange tingling heat bloomed on my wrist, right where his fingers were pressed against my pulse. For a breathtaking instant, a faint, silvery light flickered there, a ghost of an intricate, swirling mark that felt more familiar than my own reflection. It was a mate mark. My mind screamed the word, even as the light vanished, leaving nothing but tingling skin behind. My eyes flew to his, wide with shock and a terrifying, dawning wonder. He stared back, his golden eyes blazing, his jaw tight. He had felt it too. I knew he had. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf on the continent, just found his fated mate, kneeling in disgrace on the floor of his great hall. And his expression was not one of joy. It was one of utter, catastrophic conflict. Chapter 4, The Gilded Cage. The world came back into focus with a shuddering breath. I was still in his arms, the Alpha King's arms. The great hall was so quiet you could hear a pin drop, filled with the frozen shock of 100 wolves. His scent, that wild, clean smell of storms and pine, was all around me, a dizzying reality that made my head spin. He didn't let go. Instead, his grip tightened, a possessive anchor in the spinning room. His jaw was a hard line of granite, his golden eyes blazing with an emotion so fierce, so conflicted, it stole the air from my lungs. Then his voice, a low rumble that vibrated through my very bones, shattered the silence. The gala is over. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that echoed with absolute power. The pack broke, not with a rush, but with a sudden, silent urgency, people melting away into the night as if fleeing a fire. No one looked at us. No one dared. In moments, the vast hall was empty, leaving only the two of us standing in the shimmering debris of my humiliation. He finally loosened his hold, but only to slide his hand to the small of my back, a firm pressure that guided me from the room. We walked through endless, echoing corridors, our footsteps the only sound against the cold stone. The palace was a maze of shadows and moonlight, a place of immense beauty that felt like a prison. He led me to a heavy oak door and pushed it open, revealing a suite of rooms so luxurious they made the great hall seem modest. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, casting a warm glow over plush velvet chairs and a bed so large it could sleep a family. A balcony overlooked a garden bathed in silver light. It was breathtaking and terrifying. "You will stay here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any of the heat I'd seen in his eyes. He finally released me, and the loss of his warmth was a physical blow. My own voice came out as a shaky whisper. "Stay here? For how long?" I need to go home. My mother will be worried." He turned, his back to the fire, his face thrown into sharp, dangerous shadows. "Your mother has been informed that you are safe. You are not going home." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my shock. This wasn't a rescue. This was a capture. "Why?" I demanded, a sliver of my old defiance returning. "Because of my name? Because of who my father was? Is this some kind of punishment?" His expression didn't change, but something flickered in the depths of his gaze. "You will remain in the palace under observation." The word hung in the air, a silken threat. He made it sound like a simple precaution, but I knew better. I knew what it meant for a Sinclair to be under an Alpha King's observation. It was the beginning of the end. He was keeping me here because he'd finally found an excuse, a public spectacle to justify whatever retribution he'd been planning for years. Tears of helpless fury pricked my eyes. "I've done nothing wrong." "That," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft level, "is what I intend to find out." He started to leave, his presence so large it seemed to shrink the room as he moved. A desperate, foolish impulse made me take a step after him. I had to make him understand. I had to plead my case. "Please, Your Majesty." I didn't get another word out. A sound ripped through the air, a low, guttural growl that vibrated from his chest. It was not human. It was the sound of a possessive primal beast, a warning that had nothing to do with the calm, controlled king and everything to do with the wolf beneath his skin. His entire body went rigid, and he stopped dead, his hand on the door. He didn't even turn around. The warning was clear. Don't follow. Don't try to leave. The gilded door clicked shut, leaving me alone in a beautiful cage, with the terrifying echo of a monster's promise. Chapter 5. Whispers and Shields. I woke to the unfamiliar softness of silk sheets and the heavy weight of dread. For a moment, I let myself believe it had all been a terrible, vivid nightmare. The fall, the laughter, the king's shocking touch. But the opulent room, with its morning light streaming through vast windows, was cruelly real. The scent of pine and storm still lingered faintly in the air, a ghostly reminder of its owner. I was a prisoner. A guest, the servants called me, but their eyes were watchful, their smiles polite but strained. They brought me trays of delicious food I couldn't eat and offered me books I couldn't read. The palace was a silent, sprawling labyrinth, and my own footsteps were the only sound that followed me through its lonely halls. After 2 days of this suffocating solitude, he came for me again. There was no warning, just the sudden opening of my door to find him standing there, dressed in dark leather training gear that made him look even more formidable. My heart leaped into my throat. "You will dine with me," he stated, not a request. My fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but arguing was pointless. I walked beside him, careful to keep a small distance between us, though every particle of my being was aware of his presence. It was like walking next to a caged thunderstorm. As we passed a gallery lined with portraits of former alphas, we heard voices drifting from an adjoining chamber. The words were low but sharp with malice. A disgrace. To have the traitor's spawn living under this roof. The voice was old and raspy, like stones grinding together. "She is a weakness, Kaelin, a danger. The council is not pleased." I froze, the insult a slap in the face. My blood ran cold. Kaelin stopped beside me. I expected him to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't heard. He had called me a subject for observation, after all. But he didn't. He turned his head slowly, his golden gaze pinning an old, sharp-eyed wolf who had just stepped into the gallery. Lord Valerius. His face was a road map of wrinkled disapproval. Kaelin's voice was quiet, yet it cut through the air like a blade of ice. "Valerius, you will show my guest respect." His tone was deceptively soft, but the power rippling beneath it was unmistakable. "Her name is Linda, and her comfort is my command. Is that understood?" The old lord paled, his eyes widening in shock before he gave a stiff, jerky bow. "Alpha King." The words were choked with resentment. Kalen held his gaze for a moment longer, a silent assertion of dominance before turning and continuing to walk as if nothing had happened. My mind reeled. Why? Why would he defend me? It made no sense. He was the one imprisoning me, yet he was also the one shielding me from the vipers in his own court. The rest of the walk was silent, the tension between us thick enough to taste. At my door, he paused. I murmured a thank you, my voice barely audible, my confusion a tangled mess in my chest. He just gave a curt nod. As he turned to leave, his hand brushed against mine. Fire. A jolt of pure energy shot up my arm, so powerful it made me gasp. I looked down. On my wrist, where his fingers had grazed my skin, the silvery mate mark was glowing. It pulsed with a soft, ethereal light, no longer a ghost, but a brilliant, undeniable truth. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. He stared at it, his eyes wide with the same shock I felt, his carefully constructed mask of control completely gone. We both saw it. We both felt it. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a mistake. It was real, and it was going to ruin us both. Chapter 6. The Beast and the Vow. Sleep was impossible. The ghost of his touch still burned on my skin, the image of that glowing mark branded behind my eyelids. He protected me. He imprisoned me. He burned me with a single touch. Who was this man? This king? My thoughts were a frantic, chaotic storm, and the beautiful, silent room felt like it was closing in on me. I needed air. I needed to escape the lingering scent of him that haunted this gilded cage. I slipped out onto the balcony and followed a stone staircase down into the gardens. The night was cool and quiet. A huge white moon hung in the inky sky, bathing the world in silver. The air smelled of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine, a sweet, intoxicating perfume that did little to soothe my frayed nerves. I walked past silent fountains and sleeping rose bushes, my bare feet cold against the dew-kissed grass. For a few moments, there was a fragile peace, a sense of being small and hidden in the vast sleeping palace. But I wasn't alone. "You should not be out here." His voice came from the shadows, that same deep rumble, but this time it was different. It was rougher, strained. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Kalen stepped out from under a weeping willow, his form a dark silhouette against the moonlight. "You were supposed to be in your room." "I couldn't breathe," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. My confusion and fear finally boiled over into a desperate need for answers. "What do you want from me, Kalen? Why bring me here just to torment me? Why defend me one moment and look at me like I'm a curse the next?" He moved closer, and the air grew heavy, charged with that same electric tension from before. "You think I want this?" he growled, the sound more beast than man. His eyes began to shift, the gold within them brightening, glowing with an eerie, feral light. "You are a complication I do not need, a distraction I cannot afford." "Then let me go," I cried, taking a step back. "I can't." The words were a tortured admission. He took another step and another, stalking me now, his movements no longer entirely human. They were the fluid, predatory steps of a wolf. His shadow fell over me, and I saw his fangs, white and sharp, elongate past his lips. His control was shattering right before my eyes. My wolf. He won't allow it. He wants... His voice trailed off into a guttural snarl. I should have been terrified. A primal part of me was screaming to run, to flee from the monster he was becoming. But another, deeper part of me, the part that recognized him, stood its ground. It saw the agony in his eyes, the war he was fighting with himself. He was right in front of me now, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He reached for me, his fingers not quite human, tipped with dark, sharp claws. He was going to mark me, to claim me. I could see the raw, desperate hunger in his eyes. He lunged. I flinched, bracing for the inevitable pain, the bite that would seal our fates forever. But it never came. In a feat of impossible self-control, he twisted at the last second. Instead of closing his teeth on my throat, he brought his own hand to his mouth. A sickening crunch echoed in the silent garden as his fangs bit down on his own flesh. A strangled, agonized sound was ripped from his throat. He stumbled back, clutching his hand, blood dripping from the wound onto the pristine white roses at his feet. He was breathing heavily, his body trembling with the effort of containing the beast inside him. He finally lifted his head, and the look he gave me was one of pure self-loathing and bleak despair. The feral gold in his eyes had receded, leaving behind only the tormented man. "This," he choked out, the word thick with pain and blood. "This curse between us. It can never be." He took a shuddering breath, his voice dropping to a cold, dead whisper that was more wounding than any shout. "I will never claim you." Chapter 7. Rules of the Hunt. His words hung in the moonlit garden, a vow of ice that froze my heart. I will never claim you. He had left me there, standing amongst the blood-stained roses, his self-inflicted wound a brutal testament to the war he was fighting. I stumbled back to my room, but the gilded cage offered no comfort. His rejection was a phantom pain, an ache for something I never should have allowed myself to hope for. The sun rose on a new, colder reality. He was my mate, and he would never be mine. From that day forward, Kalen was a ghost. I would feel his presence in the castle, a distant hum of power, but I never saw him. It was a strange kind of torment, to be held captive by a man who refused to even look at you. Then, a week after the incident in the garden, a royal decree was delivered by a stern-faced beta. I was no longer to be confined to my rooms. By the Alpha King's command, I was to be integrated into palace life. I was assigned duties in the royal library, a quiet, dusty world of forgotten stories and sleeping histories. It was a clever move. It gave me a purpose, a routine, but it also put me on display. Every scholar, every courtier who came to peruse the scrolls, would see me there. The traitor's daughter, the king's strange pet project. Every smile I was given was tested. Every polite nod was weighed. I was being watched. Always. It was in that silent, lonely world of books that he found me. I was reaching for a heavy tome on the history of lunar gifts when a smooth voice spoke from just behind me. "Allow me." A strong hand reached over my shoulder, easily retrieving the book and placing it in my hands. I turned, startled, to face a man I didn't recognize. He was tall and handsome, with warm brown eyes and a disarming smile. His scent was of sandalwood and open plains, a visiting alpha from another pack. "I am Lord Damon, of the Sunstone Pack," he said, his voice a rich, charming baritone. He gave a slight bow, his eyes never leaving my face. "And you must be the mysterious Omega who has captured our king's undivided attention." His words were a little too bold, his smile a little too practiced. "I am Linda Sinclair," I replied, my voice quiet. "Ah, a Sinclair," he mused, his gaze sweeping over me with an appreciative gleam that made me uncomfortable. "An Omega of such rare beauty, hidden away in a palace of books. Tell me, is our king a fool for keeping you a secret, or a brilliant strategist for hiding his most valuable treasure?" I stiffened. "I am not a treasure, my lord." "No?" He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "Every wolf in this citadel is talking about you, the clumsy Omega who brought the king to his knees." He leaned in, his voice dropping. "They see a weakness. I see an opportunity." His attention was unsettling, but it was also the first direct, non-hostile conversation I'd had in weeks. It was a confusing mix of danger and flattery. I tried to end the conversation, to retreat back into the safety of the shelves, but he was persistent. He asked about my family, about my life, his questions gentle but probing. It felt like a hunt, a slow, patient circling. Just as I was murmuring an excuse to leave, he produced a single perfect white rose from behind his back. "From my homeland," he said softly, "a symbol of new beginnings." As I hesitantly reached for the flower, a sudden chill washed over me. I felt a familiar, intense gaze, a prickle of raw power from across the vast library. I looked up and saw him, Kalen. He stood in a distant, shadowed archway, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. He wasn't looking at Damon. He was looking at the rose in my hand. He watched for a long, charged moment before turning and disappearing back into the shadows, leaving behind a silence more threatening than any shout. The hunt had a new player, and the king was beginning to show his teeth. Chapter 8. The Wolf and the Healer. Kalen's silent, possessive anger was a constant presence in the days that followed. He never spoke of the incident in the library, but I felt his eyes on me whenever Lord Damon drew near. Damon, for his part, seemed to enjoy the challenge, his visits becoming more frequent, his charm more pointed. He was a complication I didn't know how to handle, a piece on a game board I didn't understand. I was caught between a man who had rejected me and another who saw me as a prize. The palace, once just a lonely cage, now felt like a brewing battlefield. The tension finally snapped one afternoon. Shouts echoed from the main training grounds below my balcony. The sharp, violent clash of steel on steel followed by a roar of pain that was not entirely human. I rushed to the balustrade. A crowd of guards was gathered, their energy panicked. I heard fractured whispers carried on the wind. The king. He lost control. The sparring partner. My blood ran cold. He was hurt. A few minutes later, word came that he had dismissed the pack healers, locking himself in his chambers. Everyone was ordered to stay away. But something inside me, a strange, insistent pull that defied all logic and fear, wouldn't let me obey. The thought of him in there, wounded and alone with the beast I'd seen in the garden, was a torment I couldn't bear. This was foolish. It was reckless. It was a choice that went against every instinct for self-preservation I had. I had to go to him. The royal guards outside his door tried to stop me, their faces grim. "No one is to enter." "His wolf is agitated," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "The healers will only make it worse. Please, let me try." I didn't know where the words came from, but they must have held some conviction, because after a long, hesitant moment, they stepped aside. I pushed the heavy door open and slipped inside. The room was a disaster. A heavy oak table was overturned, and claw marks scored the stone walls. Kalen stood with his back to me, shirtless, his powerful muscles coiled with tension. A deep, ragged gash wept blood down his side, the wound angry and inflamed. A low, continuous growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure agony and rage. "Get out!" he snarled without turning. My heart hammered, but I took a step forward. "You're hurt." "I said get out!" he roared, spinning to face me. His eyes were blazing gold, his fangs partially extended. This was not the king, this was the beast, cornered and wounded. Instead of running, I found a strange calm settling over me. "Your wolf is in pain," I said softly, my voice a quiet counterpoint to his fury. I slowly walked towards him, my hands held up in a placating gesture. He snarled again, a clear warning, but I didn't stop until I was standing right in front of him. The heat rolling off his body was immense. The smell of his blood was thick in the air. "Let me help," I whispered. And I reached out. The moment my fingertips brushed the hot skin near the wound, it happened. A soft, silvery light, gentle as moonlight, bloomed from my palm. It wasn't the fiery spark of the mate bond. It was something else entirely. It was serene, peaceful. As the light touched him, The effect was instantaneous. The violent tension drained out of his body like water from a shattered glass. The fierce golden glow in his eyes softened, receding until only the tormented man remained. The deep, rumbling growl in his chest hitched, then smoothed into a ragged sigh of relief. The wound, which had been refusing to close, began to knit together under my touch. He stared at my hand, then at my face, his mask of command completely gone. In its place was raw, stunned disbelief. And something else. A flicker of profound, unguarded need that shook me to my core. For one breathless second, he wasn't a king or a beast. He was just a man, wounded and weary, looking at me as if I were the only source of peace in his world. The intensity of the moment, the sheer intimacy of it, broke the spell. He flinched back as if my touch had become a fire, his defenses slamming back into place. His face hardened, a wall of stone. "Out!" he rasped, his voice raw, but the primal fury was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled exhaustion. I retreated, my hand still tingling with a strange, cool light, leaving him in the wreckage of his chambers. We had shared something impossible, a secret that now bound us closer than any rejection could ever tear apart. Chapter 9. A Shield of Fury. A fragile truce settled over the palace in the wake of that secret healing. Kalen still kept his distance, but the air between us had changed. It was no longer cold with rejection. It was humming with a dangerous, unspoken current. He knew. I knew. I was more than just his fated mate. I was something else, something that could soothe the beast he fought so hard to control. And that knowledge, that power, made me more of a threat to his carefully ordered world than ever before. The council felt it too. I saw it in their suspicious glances, in the way they would fall silent when I entered a room. I was no longer just the traitor's daughter. I was an unknown quantity, an unpredictable variable in their political games. The tension came to a head during the festival of the first hunt, a formal public ceremony. To my horror, Kalen commanded that I join the royal procession. It was a bold, deliberate statement. He flanked me with his personal guard, placing me just a few steps behind him, a position of honor and of extreme visibility. It was his way of declaring to the entire pack, to his watchful council, that I was under his direct and absolute protection. But walking through the crowded colonnade, with hundreds of eyes on me, I didn't feel protected. I felt like a target. The attack was silent, swift, and born of shadow. I was watching Kalen's back, the way his powerful shoulders moved under the fine black silk of his tunic, when I saw it. A flicker of movement in a high, shadowed archway to our left. A dark shape. A glint of metal where the sun should not have been. My breath caught. A scream died in my throat. There was no time to think. No time to weigh the consequences. There was only a primal, overwhelming instinct to protect him. "Kalen!" My voice was a strangled cry as I launched myself forward. I slammed into his hard back with all my weight, shoving him with a strength I didn't know I possessed. He stumbled, a grunt of surprise escaping him as he was thrown off balance. In that same split second, a sharp thwack echoed from the stone pillar right where his head had been. A slender, black-feathered dart quivered in the marble, its tip weeping a dark, oily substance. Poison. Chaos erupted. The crowd screamed. The guards drew their weapons, forming a protective circle. But Kalen didn't even look at the dart. He didn't look at the screaming courtiers. He turned, his eyes finding mine, and in them, I saw a flicker of disbelief quickly consumed by an inferno of pure, unrestrained fury. He didn't waste a second. A roar, so deep and guttural it shook the very stones beneath our feet, ripped from his throat. It was the sound of the Alpha King fully unleashed, a promise of bloody retribution. He moved in a blur of black silk and lethal grace, launching himself toward the shadowed archway. There was a single choked-off scream, a sickening crunch of bone, and then silence. He reappeared a moment later, a terrifying specter of royal wrath, A smear of blood marked his jaw. He stalked back to me, ignoring the panicked guards and the horrified court. His hand clamped around my arm, his grip a band of steel, and he hauled me behind him, shielding my body with his own. He stood there, a living wall between me and the world, his chest heaving, his golden eyes scanning the crowd for any other threats. In that moment, everything was laid bare. This was not politics. This was not a calculated display of protection. This was the raw, possessive instinct of a male protecting his mate. Everyone saw it, and I heard it. The final, chilling verdict, whispered from the pale lips of Lord Valerius to a fellow councilman. You see, I was right. The girl is his weakness. She will be the end of him. Chapter 10. The Serpent's Murmur. The palace was on lockdown. Guards patrolled the corridors in pairs, their expressions grim, their senses on high alert. I was a prisoner once more, confined to my opulent suite for my own safety. But the memory of Kalin shielding me with his body, the visceral fury in his roar, was a fire that burned away my fear. He had protected me. In that moment, with poison in the air, he had made his choice. And now, the council's chilling verdict echoed in my mind. The girl is his weakness. She will be the end of him. They saw me not as a person, but as a weapon to be used against him. And that I could not allow. Restless energy surged through me, a desperate need to do something. I was not a pawn in their games. During my lonely days in the library, I had discovered more than just history. I had found old castle schematics, maps of forgotten passages that honeycombed the walls. Driven by a newfound resolve, I found the hidden entrance behind a tapestry in my room and slipped into the cold, dark arteries of the citadel. I would not be their caged bird. I would become a ghost, a listener. I navigated the cramped, dusty spaces, following the sounds of muffled voices until I reached a grate that overlooked the council's private meeting chamber. Below, Lord Valerius stood before a crackling fire, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. He was speaking to two other high-ranking betas, their faces cloaked in shadow and ambition. "His Majesty is compromised," Valerius hissed, his words sharp with venom. "He is blinded by this creature. We cannot challenge him directly. His wolf is too unstable. He would tear the pack apart for her." A younger lord shifted uneasily. "Then what can be done, Valerius? He shielded her openly. He has all but claimed her." "We do not attack the king," Valerius said, a cunning smile twisting his lips. "We attack his foundation. We poison the very ground she walks on." He paced before the fire, his shadow looming large and monstrous on the wall. "We remind the pack of what she is. We remind the king of the traitor's blood that flows in her veins. We use the father's sin to condemn the daughter. We will make her so politically toxic that even he will have to cast her aside." My blood ran to ice. For years, I had carried the weight of my father's name like a shroud. I had bowed my head, accepted the shame, and tried to survive in the wreckage he had left behind. But hearing his memory being sharpened into a weapon, a dagger aimed at both me and the Alpha King who had saved my life, something inside me snapped. A dormant, sleeping fury uncoiled in my chest. He was my father. He had loved me. Was the man who taught me to read, who called me his little moonbeam, truly the monster history claimed him to be? Valerius's voice dropped even lower, and I had to press my ear to the cold grate to hear. "Besides, the old Alpha King had his reasons for the official story. Some truths are far more dangerous than the lies that hide them." A chill, entirely separate from the drafty passage, snaked down my spine. This was deeper than I ever imagined. It wasn't just about my father's alleged crime. It was about a secret the council was protecting, a truth so dangerous they had built a wall of lies around it and used my family as the mortar. I crept back the way I came, my heart pounding a frantic, rebellious rhythm. My silence was over. My passive acceptance was done, because they had made a fatal mistake. They had threatened him, and in doing so, they had finally given me a reason to fight. Chapter 11. A Father's Last Words. The council's plot had ignited a desperate fire within me. I had to know the truth. Not just for me, but for Kaylin. I tore my luxurious room apart, searching for, I didn't even know what, a clue, a forgotten letter, anything. Then, a memory surfaced, a story my mother used to tell me about my father, back when we lived in the Citadel. A secret hiding spot, a treasure box for his little moonbeam, hidden in our old family quarters. Quarters that had been sealed and abandoned for over a decade. Using the secret passages once more, I navigated to a forgotten wing of the palace. The air here was thick with the smell of dust and decay. Pushing open a heavy, creaking door, I stepped into my past. Everything was shrouded in white sheets, ghostly shapes in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. I saw the faint outline of the settee where my mother used to sing to me, the small table where my father would read me stories. It was a tomb of a life that had been stolen from us. I went to the window seat, just as I remembered, my fingers tracing the dusty wood until they found it. A single floorboard that was slightly loose. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pried it up. There, nestled in the dark space below, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it, revealing a thin, leather-bound journal. His journal. My father's elegant, familiar handwriting filled the pages. I sank to the dusty floor and began to read his last entry, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. My dearest Linda. The entry began, "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened and I have failed, but know this, my little moonbeam, I did not fail our king or our pack. I am not a traitor." He went on to describe his final secret mission, given to him by the old Alpha King himself. He wasn't betraying the pack, he was saving it. Kaylin's younger brother, Prince Rylan, had been born with a lung sickness, a fragility that made some of the more ruthless council members, Valerius among them, see him as a weak link. They wanted him gone to ensure Kaylin's uncontested rise to power. My father's mission was to escort the young prince to a neutral healing clan in the northern mountains, faking his death to protect him from assassins. The attack was an ambush, he wrote, Valerius's men. I never trusted him. They were not trying to stop an escape. They were trying to silence a witness and eliminate the prince. I got Rylan away. I hope. I sent him toward the river with my most trusted guard. I stayed behind to hold them off. The final lines were scrawled, his handwriting growing weak. Tell your mother. I love her. Be brave, my daughter. The truth is a heavy burden, but shame is a heavier one. Do not let them make you carry it. My world tilted, shattering and reforming into a new, terrible shape. Grief was a tidal wave, crashing over me with a decade of suppressed force. It was followed by a surge of white-hot rage. My father was a hero. He had died protecting his king's brother. My entire life, my mother's unending sorrow, the shame that had been my constant companion, it was all built on a lie. A monstrous, calculated lie told by men who were still in power. And Kaylin, did he know? Did he believe his brother was dead? The lie wasn't just my burden. It was his too. I scrambled to my feet, the journal clutched in my hand like a holy relic. The fearful, silent girl who had crept into this room was gone, burned away by the truth. In her place stood the daughter of a hero, and she was done being quiet. I stormed out of the abandoned rooms, my purpose a blazing inferno in my chest. I would find Kaylin, and I would not ask for justice. I would demand it. Chapter 12. The Poisoned Chalice. Fueled by a righteous fury, I marched through the palace, the ghost of my father's last words my shield and my sword. I was no longer a mouse scurrying in the shadows. I was a wolf with a cause. I headed straight for Kaylin's solar, intending to slam the journal down on his desk and demand an explanation. But as I rounded a corner, the sounds of music and conversation told me I was too late. A grand feast was being held in the main dining hall, the doors thrown wide open. 2 royal guards blocked my path, their spears crossed. "The king is not to be disturbed." "It's urgent," I insisted, trying to push past them. "I have to speak with him." "No one enters without the king's permission," the guard said, his face like stone. A smooth, silken voice cut in from behind them. "On the contrary, I believe His Majesty would be delighted to have our little shadow join the festivities." Lord Valerius stepped into the corridor, a smug, predatory smile on his face. It was a look that said, "I was waiting for you. All are welcome at the king's table tonight. Please," he gestured with a magnanimous sweep of his hand, "be our guest." It was a trap. Every instinct screamed it. But to refuse would be to show fear, to retreat back into the shadows. With my father's journal feeling like a block of ice against my skin, I lifted my chin and walked past the guards into the lion's den. The hall was filled with visiting dignitaries and the highest-ranking members of the pack. Lord Damon sat at a place of honor, his eyes finding mine with a look of surprise. Kalen, seated at the head of the great table, looked up as I entered. His gaze was a flash of shock, quickly followed by a dark wave of annoyance. Valerius personally escorted me to an empty seat, his touch on my elbow feeling like a spider's crawl. The feast continued, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Then it happened. A royal cupbearer approached the throne with a single, ornate silver chalice. "A gift from the Sunstone Pack, Your Majesty," he announced. "A wine to toast our new alliance." Kalen took the chalice. He raised it high. "To new friendships," he declared, his eyes briefly and unreadably meeting mine. He took a long drink. For a second, nothing happened. Then his eyes widened in shock. A violent choking sound tore from his throat as he dropped the chalice, its contents spilling across the stone floor in a dark red stain. He clawed at his neck, his face contorting in agony before he crashed from his throne to the ground. Panic erupted. Shouts and screams filled the hall. But Valerius's voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through the chaos. "Seize her!" he roared, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me. "I saw her. She spoke with the cupbearer in the kitchens this morning. She poisoned the king." Before I could even form a denial, 2 guards were on me, their armored hands gripping my arms in a brutal, painful hold. They hauled me from my chair, dragging me towards the center of the room. The cold terror of it all was a suffocating wave, a horrifying echo of my fall at the gala. But this wasn't about shame. This was about my life. Kalen was on the floor, his body convulsing as he fought the poison. But as he saw the guards manhandling me, saw the raw terror on my face, something inside him snapped. A roar, so full of primal, possessive fury that it shook the very foundations of the hall, exploded from his lungs. With a surge of inhuman strength, he forced himself up to his hands and knees. His eyes were no longer human. They were solid, blazing gold. Black fur bristled along his arms, his fangs elongating into lethal daggers. He was losing control. The king was gone, and the beast was taking his place. The guards holding me froze, their faces paling in utter terror. His voice was a low, lethal grrrl, each word a struggle against the poison and his own raging wolf. "Touch her again," he snarled, a promise of a bloody massacre hanging in the air. "And I will end you all." Chapter 13. The Taste of Fate. The king's growl was a promise of annihilation, a sound that held the entire room hostage. He was on the edge, a breath away from unleashing a massacre. The guards holding me were frozen, their faces masks of pure terror. But through my own fear, I felt it, the frantic, agonized beat of his heart, the raging of the wolf fighting the poison inside him. He wasn't a monster. He was in pain, and I was the only one who could help him. With a surge of strength I didn't know I possessed, I ripped my arms free from the stunned guards. "Kalen!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the tense silence. I rushed to his side, ignoring the gasps from the court and the furious glare from Lord Valerius. I fell to my knees in front of him, right into the heart of his rage. "Look at me," I pleaded, my voice dropping to a desperate whisper. I placed my hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. The familiar silvery light bloomed from my palm, soft and serene. It was like pouring cool water onto a raging fire. The golden inferno in his eyes flickered. The lethal tension in his powerful frame lessened, his muscles uncoiling just enough. The snarling beast receded, and the man, the king, fighting for his life, looked at me through a haze of agony. The public display of my gift silenced every accusation. Who would believe a poisoner could also be a healer? Valerius's perfectly laid trap had just been undone by a power he could never have anticipated. Loyal guards surged forward, flanking their king, their spears now pointed outward at the stunned council members. They helped him to his feet, and he leaned on them heavily, his strength failing. His eyes, however, never left my face. "She comes with me," he rasped, his voice raw. The hours that followed were a blur. I was no longer a prisoner, but I wasn't free. I was his anchor. I stayed by his side in his vast, Spartan chambers as his body fought the vicious poison. I held his hand, my calming gift a constant, steady flow that seemed to soothe his wolf and aid his own formidable healing abilities. When the worst was over, he lay weak and exhausted against a mountain of pillows, the sweat on his brow gleaming in the firelight. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "After everything, I rejected you. I let them hurt you. Why did you save me?" My hand tightened on his. I pulled the small, worn journal from my dress. "Because my father taught me to protect my pack, even when it doesn't protect you back," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. I opened it to the last page. "And because they have been lying to us both." He read his father's last words, his expression shifting from exhaustion to stunned disbelief, then to a deep gut-wrenching grief. He looked at me, truly looked at me, the walls of duty and denial and kingship stripped away, leaving only the man. A man whose brother had been stolen from him by the same lie that had ruined my life. The air between us crackled, thick with shared loss and a bond that was now forged in truth and fire. He reached for me, his hand gentle as it cupped my jaw. "Linda," he breathed, my name a prayer on his lips. He pulled me closer, and then his mouth was on mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, hungry collision. A lifetime of repression and loneliness, and longing poured into one breathtaking, forbidden moment. It was the taste of storms and pine, of desperation and fate. It was a kiss that sealed our bond, a point of no return. We broke apart, both of us breathless, the world tilting on a new axis. His golden eyes burned with an intensity that had nothing to do with his wolf. It was the man, the king, who looked at me now with raw, unguarded possession. "This changes nothing," he whispered, his voice rough. "You are in more danger now than ever before." But his eyes and the fierce, protective grip of his hand told a different story. Chapter 14. The King's Decree. The aftermath of the poisoning and the revelation in the journal was a silent, political war. Kalen recovered his strength with frightening speed, but the citadel was fractured. The council, led by a seething Lord Valerius, saw my influence over the king not as a blessing, but as a catastrophic threat. They saw his moment of weakness, his feral defense of me, as proof that I was, as they claimed, his undoing. They could not execute me for a crime I had so clearly not committed, so they chose a different, sharper blade. They delivered their ultimatum in the throne room 2 days later. I was not there, but Kalen told me everything, his face carved from ice, his eyes holding a bleak, terrifying emptiness. Valerius had invoked the oldest laws of the pack. "The king cannot be mated to the bloodline of a convicted traitor," the old wolf had declared, his voice ringing with false piety. "The pack will see it as a stain on the crown. They will not follow a king whose heart is compromised by dishonor. Your Majesty has a choice. Abdicate your throne, or cast her out. There is no other path." his crown or his mate, his kingdom, or the woman who was his literal other half. I was summoned to the throne room that afternoon. The entire court was assembled, a sea of grim, watchful faces. I walked the long aisle toward the throne, my heart a cold stone in my chest, foolishly believing he had a plan, that he would use my father's journal to clear my name and defy them all. Kalen sat upon the massive stone throne, his face an unreadable mask, his golden eyes looking right through me. When I stood before him, he rose. His voice was not his own. It was the cold, formal, disembodied voice of the crown. "Linda Sinclair," he began, the name a blade against my skin. "The evidence presented against your father, Kalen Sinclair, for the crime of treason, was judged and found to be true by my father, the former Alpha King. That judgment stands." A collective gasp went through the room. My own breath hitched. "No." "For the stability of this pack," he continued, his voice unwavering, each word a hammer blow against my heart. "For the sanctity of the throne, there can be no question of loyalty." He looked down at me, his eyes empty voids. "Therefore I, Alpha King Kalen, formally and publicly reject any and all bonds between us. You are not my mate." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. A scream of pure, tearing agony was ripped from my soul as the mate bond, acknowledged and then violently severed, tore through me. It was a pain beyond imagining, a ripping of the spirit that sent me crashing to my knees. On the throne, Kalen flinched as if he'd been stabbed, a muscle in his jaw twitching violently, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his throne. He was feeling it too. I knew he was. This was his sacrifice. To save my life from the council's plotting, he was killing us both. As I knelt there, broken and lost in a universe of pain, a figure stepped out of the crowd. Lord Damon. His face was a mask of grim sympathy. "If the king casts this Omega aside," he declared, his voice ringing with authority, "then I, an alpha of the sovereign Sunstone Pack, will claim her. I will offer her my protection." He moved towards me, reaching out a hand. Valerius smiled, a thin, triumphant slash in his face. It was over. They had won. Kalen had chosen his crown, and I was being claimed by another right before his eyes. Chapter 15. A Ghost on the Throne. The throne room was a maelstrom of shock and whispered speculation. Damon's hand was outstretched, a supposed offer of salvation. Kalen stood rigid on the dais, a king of stone and sorrow, his face a perfect mask of iron control that hid the howling of his own wolf. I was still on my knees, the pain of his rejection a physical void in my chest, unable to process the choice being laid before me. "An admirable offer, Lord Damon." The voice was new. It sliced through the tension with a chilling, charismatic authority that commanded immediate silence, but entirely unnecessary. Every head in the room turned. There, standing in the grand archway of the throne room, was a man flanked by two massive guards I'd never seen before. He was lean and dressed in dark, expensive leathers, carrying himself with an easy, predatory grace. He looked so much like Kalen, the same dark hair, the same strong jaw, but his smile was a sharp, unsettling curve, and his eyes held a corrupted, knowing light. He started walking down the aisle, his steps slow and deliberate. "She was never his to cast aside," the stranger continued, his gaze flicking from Damon to the throne, before it landed on me with a disturbing possessiveness. "Nor is she yours to claim." He stopped a few feet away from me, his smile widening. "She was always meant to be mine." A disbelieving whisper, torn from the depths of a decade-old grief, escaped Kalen's lips. "Rylan?" The man chuckled. "Brother, it's been a long time." Prince Rylan, the sickly boy from my father's journal. The dead prince was alive. But he was not the boy my father had died to save. This was a man, strong and dangerous, and he was not here for a tearful reunion. As if on cue, Lord Valerius and a dozen other council members dropped to one knee. All hail the true heir! Valerius cried out, his voice thick with triumph. Prince Rylan! The betrayal was absolute. The trap had never been about me. I was just the bait. Valerius hadn't been trying to force Kaelin's hand to strengthen the throne. He had been working to shatter it, to pave the way for this moment. Rylan's chilling gaze fell upon me again. My condolences on the loss of your father, Linda. He was a brave man. He got me away, just as he was supposed to. His voice was a venomous caress. But he failed to mention the arrangement our fathers made before my untimely departure. A betrothal, to unite our powerful bloodlines and secure the future of the pack. He looked from me to his brother, his eyes glinting with malice. The poison, by the way. A little test. I wanted to see if my brother still had any fight left in him. The assassination attempt? A lovely bit of theater to expose his unfortunate attachment. My blood turned to ice. It was all him. He had orchestrated everything. The kingdom was broken. Kaelin's authority was in ruins, and I was no longer a rejected mate or a traitor's daughter. I was a political chess piece, the living proof of a hero's sacrifice, and now the key to a betrothal that could legitimize a usurper's claim to the throne. Rylan held out his hand to me, his smile pure poison. The king is weakened, he announced to the stunned room, his eyes locked on his brother's. Long live the king. Chapter 16. Decree of the Damned. The throne room was a fractured kingdom in miniature. On one side stood Rylan, a ghost returned as a king, flanked by the triumphant, sneering face of Lord Valerius and his turncoat council members. On the other stood Kaelin, stripped of his authority, his face a mask of impotent fury, surrounded by a handful of loyal guards. And I was in the middle, the prize they were all fighting for. Rylan didn't seize the throne in a bloody coup. He was smarter than that. With the council's backing, he established a regency, a polite word for a cage, to guide Kaelin and the pack through this turbulent time. His first official act as the kingdom's new puppet master was to solve the problem of me. I was dragged before the council again, but this time the charge was not poison or treason. It was something far more insidious. This Omega, Linda Sinclair, Valerius announced, his voice ringing with false gravity, possesses an unsanctioned and dangerous lunar gift. We have all witnessed her ability to influence the alpha mind, to soothe the king's wolf when even his most loyal betas could not. She is not a healer. She is a witch, a focal point of chaos who has brought nothing but instability since her arrival. He let the words hang in the air, letting the fear and superstition of the pack do his work for him. For the spiritual health and security of this pack, such an anomaly must be purged. The sentence was swift. Death, by silver blade at the rising of the next full moon. Kaelin lunged forward, a roar of denial building in his chest, but Rylan's guards were there, their spears instantly at his throat. Rylan stepped in front of his brother, his expression one of mock sympathy. Now, brother. The law is the law. You wouldn't want to start a civil war over a single unfortunate Omega, would you? Think of the bloodshed. The political trap was perfect, and Kaelin was caught within its steel jaws. He couldn't fight them without destroying the very pack he was sworn to protect. I saw the agony on his face, the helpless rage of a king checkmated by his own brother. They dragged me away. Not back to the gilded cage of my suite, but down into the cold, damp darkness of the Citadel's dungeons. The scent of mildew, despair, and forgotten souls filled my lungs. The heavy iron door slammed shut, its echo the sound of my life ending. It was over. All of it. The flicker of hope I'd felt in Kaelin's kiss, the surge of pride from my father's journal, all of it was extinguished by the suffocating darkness. I had been a traitor's daughter, a political pawn, a rejected mate, and now a condemned witch. I had fought, and I had lost. I sank onto the cold stone floor, the last of my strength leaving me in a shuddering wave. I wrapped my arms around myself, a small, broken thing in the vast, consuming dark. Maybe I was never meant to be loved, I whispered to the uncaring stones. Maybe this is all I was ever destined for. Chapter 17. The Serpent's Promise. Time ceased to have meaning in the dungeon. I measured the days only by the changing of the guards and the single meal of stale bread and water they slid through a slot in the door. Above me, I could hear the faint, distant sounds of a world that was moving on without me. The citadel was changing. Through the careless whispers of the guards, I pieced together the grim reality. Rylan was a master politician. He was making promises, forging alliances. I heard that Lord Damon and his Sunstone pack had officially sworn fealty to the new regency, promised new territories and a seat of power on the new council. The kingdom was tilting, the scales of power tipping decisively away from Kaelin. He was losing, and I was the price of his defeat. One night, the scrape of the key in the lock startled me from a fitful sleep. The heavy door swung inward, and a figure holding a lantern filled the doorway. Rylan. My heart seized with a cold, primal fear. He stepped inside, his charisma a chilling, suffocating presence in the small cell. He didn't look at me like a condemned prisoner. He looked at me like a piece of art he was deciding where to hang. "It's a shame, isn't it?" he said, his voice a smooth, conversational purr. He placed the lantern on the floor, its light casting long, dancing shadows. All this drama, all this unpleasantness. Kaelin feels the crown as a burden, a sacred duty. I, on the other hand, understand the pleasure of its power. He took a step closer, and I scrambled back until my shoulders hit the cold, damp wall. "Stay away from me," I hissed. He smiled, a slow reptilian curve of his lips. "Still so full of fire. I admire that. It will serve you well as my queen." "I will never be your queen," I spat, my defiance a small, pitiful flame against his overwhelming darkness. "Oh, I think you will," he said softly. He knelt in front of me, his proximity making my skin crawl. "Our fathers betrothed us. Your unique gift will be an incredible asset. You will soothe the pack's anxieties, a beautiful, calming moonbeam while I command its strength. We will be perfect together." He reached out, his fingers tracing a cold path along my jawline. I flinched, but I did not look away. The execution is a necessary bit of political theater. Kaelin's supporters need to see you die. They need to see him fail to save you. It will break his spirit, and the pack will be mine completely. A sliver of hope, sharp and painful, pierced my despair. "So you're going to fake my death?" His smile widened, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "Oh no, nothing so crude. You will die, my dear Linda. Publicly. But death," he whispered, his cold breath on my cheek, "is not always an end. There are old dark magics, ways to bind a soul, a power, to a new vessel. I will not have you as my living queen. I will have your gift, your very essence, as my eternal, obedient servant." The world spun. He wasn't just going to kill me. He was going to erase me, to consume my soul and steal my power for his own dark purposes. He stood up, his chilling promise hanging in the air. "I'll see you at the execution," he said lightly, as if discussing the weather. He turned and left, the iron door booming shut, leaving me in a darkness that was now filled with a terror far worse than death. Chapter 18. A Mark in the Dark. This was it, the night of the full moon, the night of my execution. The air in the dungeon was heavy, thick with the finality of my last hours. Through the small barred window high on the wall, I could see the moon, a perfect, luminous silver disk in the sky. It should have been beautiful. Tonight, it felt like a cruel, indifferent god, a silent witness to my end. I waited for the heavy, rhythmic march of the execution party, for the final walk to the silver blade. But the sounds that came were wrong, a muffled shout from the corridor, a wet, sickening thud. Then, a chilling silence. My heart hammered against my ribs. The lock on my cell door clicked, and the door swung open. Two figures clad in black from head to toe, their faces hidden by shadows, slipped inside. They held long, wicked-looking knives that gleamed in the moonlight. This wasn't the execution. This was an assassination. Rylan was tying up his loose ends. The first assassin lunged. I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against the rough stone, a scream catching in my throat. Just as the blade sliced through the air where I had been, the entire iron door was ripped from its stone hinges and thrown across the corridor with a deafening crash. Kalen stood there, a whirlwind of shadow and lethal fury, his eyes blazing gold in the darkness. He had come. He had risked civil war, his throne, everything. He had come for me. The battle was a brutal, contained storm of violence. Kalen moved with a speed that was barely human, a dance of death against the two assassins. He was a king, a warrior, a god of vengeance. But he was not invincible. As he dispatched the first assassin, the second saw his chance. He slipped past Kalen's guard, his blade aimed directly at the king's exposed back. I saw it. The glint of steel. The murderous intent. It was the procession all over again, but this time there was no hesitation, no choice. There was only him. With a cry, I threw myself forward, putting my own body between Kalen and the blade. The pain was a flash of white-hot fire, a searing agony as the steel sank deep into my side. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. The strength in my legs vanished. The world dissolved into a blur of gray. I was falling, and then he was there, catching me. A roar, not of fury but of pure, soul-shattering anguish, was torn from his throat as he crushed the last assassin with a single devastating blow. He fell to his knees, gathering me into his arms. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Linda, no, stay with me." My blood was hot and slick against his hands. The life was draining out of me, the edges of my vision going dark. The bond between us was screaming, a high, keening sound of a soul being torn in two. His grief, his rage, his love, it all erupted. His wolf took over, driven by the most primal of instincts, mine, will, not, lose. He would not let me go. He would not let me die. He lowered his head, his face a mask of beautiful, terrible agony. A guttural sob broke from his lips, and then he bit me. His fangs, sharp and desperate, sank into the soft flesh where my neck met my shoulder. It wasn't a gentle claiming. It was a frantic, possessive act of utter desperation. He poured his life force, his alpha power, his very soul into me, forging the permanent, indelible mate mark in a last, hopeless attempt to save my life. A brilliant silver light exploded in the darkness, the mark blazing to life on my skin. He threw his head back, my limp body held tight against his chest. A howl, raw and broken, filled with all the pain and love and fury in the universe, echoed through the stones of the citadel. A declaration of war against his brother, the council, and fate itself. "She is mine!" Chapter 19. Chosen by the Mark Darkness. A soft, painless floating darkness. A distant sound echoed in the void, a single soul-shattering howl of love and loss that became an anchor, a thread pulling me back from the endless emptiness. I followed it, climbing hand over hand from the depths of oblivion back toward the light. The first thing I felt was not the searing pain in my side, but a deep, thrumming warmth that pulsed in time with my own heartbeat. It was a river of pure energy, of strength, flowing into me from an outside source. It was him. My eyes fluttered open. I wasn't in the cold, damp dungeon. I was in Kalen's bed, tangled in soft linen sheets that smelled of pine and storms. Sunlight streamed through a tall window. I pushed myself up, my body stiff but whole. I looked down. The fatal wound in my side was gone, leaving behind only a faint silvery scar, a ghost of the death I had escaped. My hand went to my neck. There, just above my collarbone, I felt it. A raised, intricate pattern of swirls and knots, a permanent brand on my skin that pulsed with a gentle, living warmth. The mark. He was asleep in a chair beside the bed, his head slumped forward in utter exhaustion. His hand was holding mine, his grip lax in slumber but still possessive. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and a new line of stress was etched beside his mouth. He looked not like a king, but like a man who had been to hell and back. Outside the door, I could hear the low murmur of voices, the solid presence of his most loyal guards. His desperate, possessive act had done more than save my life. It had shattered the pack. It had drawn a line in the sand. As if sensing my gaze, his eyes snapped open. The gold in them was soft, weary, and filled with a raw, heart-stopping vulnerability. "Linda," he breathed, his voice rough with sleep and relief. He sat up, his hand tightening around mine. "You're awake." "You saved me," I whispered, my fingers tracing the mark on my neck. A shadow of guilt crossed his face. "I forced the bond on you," he said, his voice heavy. "In front of everyone. I took away your choice. After everything you've suffered, I branded you as mine without your consent. It was a desperate, selfish act." I looked at him, at this powerful, broken king who had risked a civil war for me, who had howled his grief to the moon when he thought he'd lost me. I thought of my life, a long, lonely road of shame and fear. I thought of his rejection in the throne room, a pain that had nearly unmade me. And I thought of his teeth at my throat. Not an act of aggression, but the most profound declaration of love I had ever known. I reached out and touched his cheek. "You didn't take my choice, Kaylin. You made one. You chose me, when I had already accepted that I was worthless." A strength I had never felt before, born of truth and fire and a love that had stared down death, filled me from the inside out. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice clear and steady. For my whole life, they called me cursed because of my father's name. They called me a witch because of a power I didn't understand. I held his gaze, my hand still on the permanent living mark that bound my soul to his. But they were wrong. I am not cursed. I am chosen. Chapter 20. A King and His Queen. Hope, once a forbidden taste, was now the very air I breathed. We were no longer hiding. Kaylin's desperate act in the dungeon had galvanized his loyalists. We met them in a secret council chamber, a war room filled with grim-faced alphas and betas who had refused to bow to a usurper. And this time, I was not a spectator or a subject of debate. I stood beside Kaylin, not behind him, our hands clasped together, our bond a visible, palpable force in the room. We were two halves of a whole, and we would face this war together. Our greatest weapon was not an army, but the truth. Kaylin laid out Ryland's treason, his voice hard as steel. Then he looked to me. I stepped forward, my father's journal held in my hands. My voice did not tremble as I read my father's last words, his tale of heroism, his sacrifice to save the young prince who had now returned as a monster. I told them of the decades-long conspiracy, of Lord Valerius's betrayal that had cost my family everything and poisoned the kingdom from within. As I spoke, I let my gift flow, not to influence, but to soothe. A gentle silvery calm spread through the room, easing the fear and rage of the assembled wolves, uniting them in a shared sense of purpose. They looked at me now and saw not a witch, but a Luna, a queen whose power could bring peace, not just chaos. They saw the truth of what I was, the perfect balance to their alpha king. Suddenly, the chamber doors were thrown open. Ryland stood there, flanked by Lord Valerius, and, to my dismay, a grim-faced Lord Damon. They were not here to fight. They were here for one last venomous attempt at diplomacy. "A touching story," Ryland said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he sauntered into the room. "Hiding in the dark with your pack of rebels and your pet witch. Did you really think this little bedtime story would save you, brother?" Kaylin stepped in front of me, a protective shield of pure muscle and power. "You are no brother of mine, usurper." Ryland simply smiled, his cold eyes dismissing Kaylin and fixing on me. This is your last chance, Linda. That mark is a brand of desperation, not love. He can offer you nothing but a losing war and a shallow grave. Come with me. I can still give you a crown. I can give you the world." Before Kaelin could answer, I stepped out from behind him, meeting Ryland's gaze without flinching. "A crown from you is nothing but a gilded collar, Ryland," I said, my voice ringing with a strength I never knew I had. "And a world ruled by a serpent is a world I would burn to the ground. I am already where I belong." The charming mask finally cracked. A flash of pure reptilian fury contorted Ryland's handsome features. He dropped the pretense, his voice becoming a low, venomous hiss. He looked past me, his eyes locking on his brother with a promise of death. "Then you will die," he snarled at Kaelin. "I will cut you down on the battlefield myself. And when your body is cold, I will take her. That bond you cherish so much, it can be broken." He gave a cruel, knowing smile. "With enough pain." He turned and strode from the room, leaving his chilling threat hanging in the air like a shroud. The battle lines were drawn. The war for the throne was now a fight to the death for our very souls. Chapter 21. The eve of war. The night before the battle was a living, breathing thing. Our camp, nestled in a hidden valley, was a hive of tense, focused energy. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, nervous sweat, and the sharp, clean smell of whetstones on steel. Hundreds of warriors, their faces grim in the flickering firelight, prepared for the dawn. A full moon, the very same one that was supposed to have presided over my execution, now hung in the sky above us. A silent, silver witness to the war we were about to wage for the heart of the kingdom. Kaelin and I found a few precious moments of solitude on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. Below us, the campfires of our loyalists looked like a fallen constellation. Across the vast, dark expanse, we could see the distant, more numerous fires of Ryland's army. They were bigger, more confident, but they did not have what we had. "Are you afraid?" Kaelin asked, his voice a low rumble beside me. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the enemy camp. "Terrified," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But not of dying. I'm afraid of losing this, losing you." He finally turned to me, his golden eyes soft in the moonlight. He took my hand, his calloused fingers lacing through mine. "I spent my whole life building walls, Linda, to control my wolf, to carry the weight of the crown. I thought love a mate. I thought it was a weakness." He brought my hand to his lips, kissing my knuckles gently. "I was a fool. Loving you is the only source of strength I have left." His confession, so raw and vulnerable, broke down the last of my own fears. I leaned into him, my head resting on his shoulder, the solid, steady beat of his heart a comfort against my ear. This was home. Not a place, but a person. We stayed like that for a long time, sharing a silence that was more intimate than any words. The war could wait. The world could wait. Later, in the privacy of our tent, that silent understanding blossomed into something more. He came to me not as a king claiming his queen, but as a man bearing his soul to the woman he loved. It was a desperate, beautiful act in the face of our own mortality. Our joining was not just passion, it was a promise, a vow sealed in skin and scent and spirit. It was the ferocious, tender claiming of two souls who had fought through hell to find each other, a final, silent declaration that no matter what the dawn brought, we belonged to each other, in this life and whatever came next. As the first pale fingers of dawn began to stretch across the horizon, we stood together at the edge of the camp, dressed for battle. The horns of war would sound any minute. I looked at the man beside me, my king, my mate, my Kaelin, and I saw no fear in his eyes, only a burning, resolute love. He squeezed my hand, his grip firm and sure. "Whatever comes," he said, his voice a powerful, unbreakable vow that echoed the certainty in my own heart. "We face it together. We fight as one." Chapter 22. a kingdom of ash and bone. The horns of war screamed at the rising sun, a promise of blood and iron. The battle was a roaring, chaotic beast, a clash of two armies that had once been one pack. From a command post on a fortified ridge, I watched the horror unfold. My gift, once a secret shame, was now a weapon of hope. I closed my eyes, reaching out with my senses, not to the chaos, but through it, finding the minds of our warriors through the thrumming mate bond I shared with their alpha. I couldn't fight their battles for them, but I could send them a wave of serenity, a silver thread of calm to cut through the red haze of battle fury, sharpening their focus and steadying their hands. Then, as if by some unspoken command, the swirling tide of the battle parted. In the center of the blood-soaked field, two figures met, Kaelin and Rylan. The duel for the soul of the kingdom had begun. Rylan was a viper, fast and fluid, his movements a blur of cruel, elegant violence. Kaelin was a bear, a creature of pure, indomitable strength. They crashed together, steel ringing on steel, snarls ripping through the air. Through my bond with Kaelin, I felt the rage building in him, the feral, untamed part of his wolf straining to break free. He was fighting with grief and fury for the brother he had lost twice, once to a lie, and now to this corrupted, power-hungry monster. Rylan taunted him, using his rage against him, tiring him out. Kaelin was close to breaking, close to letting the beast take over. If he did that, he would lose. I am with you, I projected through the bond, pouring all of my love, all of my newfound strength into that single thought. You are not alone. You are the king. I felt him receive it. A shudder went through him, a visible steadying of his powerful shoulders. The wild, feral gold in his eyes sharpened into a focused, intelligent blaze. He was no longer just a raging beast. He was the Alpha King, fighting with lethal, calculated precision. The tide of the duel turned. He began to anticipate Rylan's moves, his strength now guided by a cold, clear purpose. The final moments were a brutal, tragic ballet. Kaelin disarmed his brother, the sword flying from Rylan's grasp. With a final, sorrowful roar, Kaelin drove his own blade home. A collective gasp went through both armies. The war was over. Rylan sank to his knees, a look of stunned disbelief on his face before collapsing into the mud. Kaelin stood over him, his chest heaving, a king victorious, but a man heartbroken. Rylan's forces began to drop their weapons, surrendering in the face of their leader's demise. But just as a wave of relief began to wash over me, a voice, shrill and defiant, rose from the ranks of the captured council members. It was Lord Valerius, his face pale but his eyes burning with a final, desperate venom. "The usurper is dead," he shrieked, his voice carrying across the silent battlefield. "But the witch who started this war still lives. Her dark gift brought this ruin upon us. To heal this pack, to cleanse this land of the curse she brought, the law must be satisfied. The law demands her life." A murmur went through the exhausted, grieving warriors on both sides. He was planting a final seed of poison. The battle was won, but in the eyes of the law, I was still the source of it all. Chapter 23. The Alpha's Submission. Valerius's words hung in the bloody air, a final, desperate gambit to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The pack was silent, exhausted, and uncertain. They looked from the body of the fallen prince to their victorious king and then to me. I was the witch, the weakness, the cause of all this death. Kaelin stood alone in the center of the battlefield, the weight of a broken kingdom on his shoulders. Everyone waited for his decree, his royal command that would silence the dissent and seal his authority. He did not give it. Instead, he turned his back on his dead brother, his face a mask of profound sorrow and unshakable resolve. He began to walk, not towards Valerius to deliver a final judgment, not to his commanders to give orders, but towards me. The sea of warriors parted before him as he moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. He stopped directly in front of me, his golden eyes finding mine. holding them with an intensity that blocked out the entire world. And then, the Alpha King, the Conqueror, the most powerful wolf on the continent, knelt. A gasp rippled through the thousands of assembled wolves. In the mud and blood and ruin of his victory, Kalen sank to one knee and then the other, until he was kneeling at my feet. It was the Great Hall all over again, but everything was reversed. He was the one kneeling. I was the one standing. He bowed his head, his dark hair falling forward, and bared his throat. It was the ultimate, most sacred gesture an alpha could make, a complete and total surrender of his power, his will, his very life, to his chosen mate. It was a silent declaration, more powerful than any royal decree that I was not his weakness. I was his sovereign. "You are my law," the gesture said. "You are my queen." Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. I was trembling, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his act. The entire pack held its breath, watching. This was my moment, my choice. With a shaky hand, I reached out. My fingers, still glowing with a faint, silvery light, gently touched the warm, vibrant skin of his neck, right over the mate mark I now shared with him. It was not a brand of ownership. It was a symbol of unity. My touch was my acceptance. It was me, finally, claiming him. The moment my skin met his, a single low howl rose from a warrior standing near us. It was a sound of pure, reverent awe. Another voice joined, then another, and another. The sound swelled, a chorus of hundreds, then thousands of wolves, from both his army and Ryland's, lifting their voices in a single, unified, deafening salute. It was a howl of surrender, of acceptance, of rebirth. They were not howling for their king. They were howling for their Luna, their queen. And in that moment, our pack was no longer broken. It was whole. Chapter 24. The Luna Queen. Spring came to a healing kingdom. The snows melted, revealing a land scarred by war but ready for new growth. 6 months after the battle, the Great Hall was filled once more. But this was not the night of the gala, full of brittle laughter and cruel whispers. This was the day of my coronation. The light streaming through the stained glass windows was warm and golden. The air was filled with the scent of spring flowers and the murmur of a hopeful, united pack. I walked the long aisle, the same path I had once stumbled down in disgrace. But I was not the same woman. The cheap, borrowed dress was gone, replaced by a gown of deep blue velvet, embroidered with silver thread in the pattern of my mate mark. My head was held high, my steps were steady and sure. I was not a shadow. I was a presence, a quiet, calming light that the pack now looked to for guidance. I was their Luna. Kalen waited for me before the throne. He was already crowned, a king more powerful and beloved than ever before, because he had shown his people that true strength lay not in dominance, but in love and surrender. He smiled at me, a real, unguarded smile that reached the depths of his golden eyes, and the entire hall seemed to fade away until it was only him. He took my hand, but he did not pick up the slender, silver Luna crown himself. He gestured to the oldest she-wolf in the pack, a respected elder whose own mate had been a council member loyal to my father. With trembling, reverent hands, she took the crown and placed it upon my head. It was a gesture that sealed everything. My rule was not a gift from the king. It was the will of the pack. As the cool metal settled on my brow, I was no longer Linda Sinclair, the traitor's daughter, the cursed Omega. I was Queen Linda, Luna of the Great Northern Pack. Later that night, we stood on the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens, the same gardens where he had once made a vow to reject me. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder. We stood in a comfortable, perfect silence, watching over our peaceful, sleeping kingdom. My whole life, I had been haunted by a single question. Could someone branded unworthy ever be truly loved and chosen? The answer was here, in the steady beat of his heart against my back, in the weight of the crown on my head, in the deep, unshakable peace in my own soul. I had not just been chosen. I had been the key, the healer of a broken king and the uniter of a fractured pack. I was not unworthy. I had been essential all along. Kalen nuzzled my neck, his lips brushing against the permanent silvery mark that bound us. "My queen," he murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble. "My king," I whispered back, leaning into his strength. "My mate." Together, we lifted our heads to the brilliant, silent moon. A joint howl rose into the night, his, a deep, powerful, and controlled sound of an alpha at peace. Mine, a clear, steady, and serene harmony that intertwined with his. It was a song of triumph, of love reborn from the ashes of lies and war. A song of two broken souls who had defied a world determined to tear them apart, and had found their destiny not in disgrace but forever claimed in each other's arms.